As we slowly enter the fall season, I'd like to share a story with you that happened to me a few years ago. I have mentioned this story to some of my close personal friends and family, many of which don't believe me, and that's fine. They probably think I'm just joking around or trying to scare them, but I know I experienced something that night and I wish I had a better explanation for it. At the time these events took place, I lived on a quiet street a little outside the city, but not quite into the suburbs. My street had a big rundown house at the very end of the block that was across from an unused parking lot and an out-of-business bar. The person who inhabited the house before it became dilapidated was Mrs. Morgan. Mrs. Morgan was an old curmudgeon in every sense of the word. Every time my friends and I would walk by the house, she would yell at us and make some insanely random comment like we were trampling her garden or using her garbage to play hide-and-seek or some other incoherent nonsense that wasn't true. Even though my friends and I did get into some adolescence trouble around the neighborhood, we never did anything to Mrs. Morgan. Our parents always told us that we should try and be nice. I mean, she was a widow and had no children, so it must have been a pretty lonely life. Rewind about 3 years ago and Mrs. Morgan unfortunately passes away, and the house becomes abandoned and, I believe, eventually condemned. At least there were signs on the boarded-up windows and doors, but I never got close enough to read what they said. Needless to say, it became an eyesore for the community in what was a pretty quiet and uneventful street. My girlfriend at the time only lived a couple of blocks, and I would usually walk to and from her house when we hung out. It was literally a 4-minute walk tops, so it was no big deal. I would pass Mrs. Morgan's abandoned house and the empty parking lot with the out-of-business bar every time I walked to and from her house. Now fast forward to a few years ago, the last time I ever made that walk. It was about 3 a.m. on Halloween night, I guess technically November 1st, and I was walking home from my girlfriend's house. I was supposed to be home way earlier in the night, but we both fell asleep watching scary movies and pigging out on the extra candy her parents didn't hand out. As I made it to my street and started my walk past Mrs. Morgan's house, I heard a noise. I stopped for a minute to make sure it wasn't a skunk because for some odd reason that's the first thing that popped in my mind when I heard the noise. I slowed down a little bit and looked at the house as I proceeded cautiously. That's when I noticed the front door that was usually boarded up and had a sign posted on it was now open. I tried to rationalize why the door was now open, saying to myself it was probably the wind, but then again, it was a beautiful, calm night. I then paused in front of the house and looked directly at the front door, and that's when I saw her, Mrs. Morgan, right there, staring back at me. I knew for sure it was her, but how? She had passed away and the house was clearly unlivable for anyone else. At this point, I was so scared that I just shouted something out. I don't even remember if it was words or just noises. The figure stepped onto the front porch and continued to stare at me. I broke my stare and just started running back to my house, turning back every now and then to see if she was still staring at me or perhaps following me. I made it back to my house probably 30 seconds later and opened the side door and went down to my room. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I'm not sure if I was overtired or just had scary things in my subconscious with it being Halloween and watching movies all night, but I know I saw Mrs. Morgan standing there only a couple of feet away from me. Whether it was a true paranormal encounter, or something that my mind made me think I saw, I won't ever know for sure. But hey, they always say that the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest on Halloween, and now I actually believe it. Let me start this story by saying I have only shared this story with a few people up to this point. I trusted a few close friends who I thought would believe me, but that's about it. I can remember the events of this specific night vividly. My parents own a camp on a local lake about 25 minutes from my hometown. It's pretty awesome to go there, bring friends, and basically do what we want. My friends and I would usually throw smaller parties out there all summer long. There was always activity on the lake, but nothing that really ever raised any alarms. We kinda just chalked it up to either boats, wind, or animals if we thought we saw something in the lake after it got dark. One Halloween night, I decided it would be a good idea to skip the Halloween party that was taking place in town and bring my boyfriend back to the camp house for the night so he could be alone. My parents thought I would be at said Halloween party and would be spending the night at a friend's house. We arrived at the camp pretty late, around 9 or 10 p.m. One thing I remember about the camp is how dark it was, void of any street lights and usually only illuminated by the stars in the sky. My boyfriend and I stayed up for a couple of hours talking, eating, and I think we played a board game or something like that. I would guess we fell asleep at some point after midnight. After about an hour or so of sleeping, I woke up suddenly to what seemed to be a loud blast, like a gunshot but distorted somehow. I just remember it being so loud that I couldn't even remember where I was when I woke up. I looked over the couch and my boyfriend was somehow still asleep. I got up and looked out the back door window, which had a view of the lake. I saw something that looked like a light, or a ball of light over the lake. I stared at the floating light in confusion, trying to figure out what it was. Was it a flashlight or something glowing from under the water? Without really thinking, I slipped on my flip-flops and I went outside and approached the shore, still staring at the light, squinting my eyes trying to make out what it was. It was an orange-colored light, maybe 75 feet out into the lake and what seemed to be floating a couple of feet off the top of the water. After about 2 minutes of continued staring and squinting, the orange color changed to a bright purple, and several white specks of light came out of the purple glow and hovered all around the glowing orb. As I started to freak out as to what this could be, I was forced to my knees by the loud blasting noise I heard earlier. I started to plug my ears, collect myself, and turned back to the house to grab my boyfriend. I saw a huge flash, and the next thing I remember was waking up in an Adirondack chair on my neighbor's yard the next morning. My flip-flops that I wore outside to get a closer look at the lake were gone. I had no idea how to explain the events of the night, and long story short, I went to the doctor, and after seeing neurological specialists, they don't show any sign that I could have had an episode. I've been told that it was most likely a vivid nightmare, and that I was sleepwalking, and that's how I ended up on my neighbor's porch. Also, that would explain why my boyfriend never woke up. However, I believe this night I saw something otherworldly. I don't believe in the paranormal, and until this point, I didn't believe in the extraterrestrial. But this didn't feel like a nightmare. It felt real. I can still see the images and hear the noises from that night. I know many of you may not believe my story, and that's fine, but I feel like I wanted to share the experience I had that night. I'm no longer with that boyfriend, and even though he was concerned for my well-being, especially immediately after the events, I don't think he really believed my story either. Needless to say, I spend less time at the camp and am reminded of this night every year around this time, when Halloween decorations start popping up in the stores. The events of this story took place when I was 18 and in my senior year of high school. I'm 27 now and still have horrible flashbacks from that Halloween night. My friends and I liked to party in high school, and Halloween was obviously one of the best nights to go out and party. We got to dress up in sexy outfits and have an excuse to act a little crazy. My friends usually drew all the attention from the guys we went to school with. I was still friends with all the boys, but none of them really ever showed any interest outside of friendship. Anyway, on this particular Halloween, we had a party at my friend Steve's house. Like a lot of high school parties, no one knew how to handle their alcohol. At about 11, the cops had already been called for a noise complaint. The party scattered and everyone ran as to not get detained or get their information taken by police. My friend Amy, who was getting into a car with her boyfriend, told me to jump into the car with her friend Dave, and he would take us to another party, which I begrudgingly decided to do. The car ride was weird. Just him and I, who didn't know each other and didn't really have much to say. Awkward. The car smelled like Slim Jims and body odor and looked rather messy. Dave had a mask, which was on his lap while he was driving. He had a hooded sweatshirt, blue jeans, and brown work boots on to complete the costume. He also had a scraggly beard and greasy hair. I tried asking questions to make the drive less awkward, but he didn't really answer them and didn't seem interested in holding a conversation. Finally, I asked what school he went to, and he responded, "I dropped out of college a year ago." So I asked, "Well, how old are you?" He responded in a shaky, almost nervous voice, "I'm 25. This freaked me out a little bit because he was older than me and he just dropped out of college at the age of 25. Also, he was 25 and was just leaving a high school party. Trying not to let him in on the fact that I was kind of nervous, I asked, "So, how do you know Amy?" And he responded in his shaky and unflattering voice. He said, Who's Amy?" I sunk into my seat, pinching my sides, not knowing what to do. "She's the blonde who told me to get in the car with you." He responded with a very stoic, "Oh, her? Yeah. She told me you were single." I didn't respond. I honestly didn't know what to say. Did this guy really not know Amy? Or was he just tipsy and confused? I texted Amy as we were driving to tell her how angry I was, but she didn't answer. About 10 or 15 minutes in the car, which seemed like forever, we arrived at a house. It didn't seem to be a very nice part of town, or at least an area I was accustomed to going to parties. I looked for Amy's car or any car I recognized, but it was just too dark to point anything out. We approached a red door with chipped paint lit up only by a dull front light. Dave didn't even knock and just walked into the house, so I followed him, hoping to see a familiar face. The house was cold and smelled awful. We walked into the front room, which I assumed would be the living room. It was dirty and had an olive green shag carpet with an old brown couch. The walls were white with chipped paint and stains everywhere. Piles of pizza boxes and beer cans lined the floors. The room was only lit by one lamp that was on the floor, and it gave off a very low light. On the brown couch there was a man and woman sitting very close together, but not really moving. They looked to be passed out or maybe just drunk. We walked into the kitchen, which was just more of the same. Trash and that horrid smell of garbage. In the kitchen there was a man probably in his 20s who looked like he may have been using. He gave Dave a high five and introduced himself to me as Skip. He looked at Dave and back at me and smiled. His yellow teeth and bug eyes made my skin crawl. The other man in the kitchen was an older gentleman, maybe in his 40s or 50s. I couldn't tell. He said nothing and just looked at me. I felt sick to my stomach, and the only reason why I didn't run out of this place was because I had no clue where I was, and had no clue if these people were capable of anything dangerous. Again, I texted Amy with no answer, deciding to not call as my phone only had 5% battery. Dave escorted me into the back room, which was kind of like a screened-in porch. I felt a brief moment of relief seeing about 6 or 7 people out there. There were only 2 girls out of the bunch, and they were half naked and looked like they weighed a maximum of 90 pounds. I could feel everybody staring at me, but at least there was a group of people and I wasn't secluded or alone with this Dave. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt almost safe being around this larger crowd. But this temporary relief faded very quickly when the 2 girls left with all the guys who had been on the porch. They re-entered the house and disappeared out of sight. As I sat in this screened-in room trying to think of my options, Dave finally spoke up and said, "I think you're really cute." I said thanks and kind of shrugged it off. He got up and started to rub my back and began breathing very heavily. After about 5 minutes, the most unpleasant back rub I had ever had, he stepped in front of me and asked if I wanted to go somewhere more private. I said to him in a terrified, cracking voice, I'm sorry, but I'm not that kind of girl." I could see the displeasure and anger in his face, and I could feel the tears coming. Then nothing short of a miracle happened. One of the girls who went inside just a minute before began to scream erratically, swearing and yelling at everyone in the room. Dave ran upstairs, leaving me downstairs in the back room alone, and without even thinking twice, I got up and climbed out the window and ran. I didn't care that I didn't know where I was. I wasn't going to stop until I was to a gas station or a 7-Eleven or something. I was running down the street, staying close to the sidewalk, trying not to bring any attention to myself. After what seemed like a few minutes, I luckily approached a 24-hour Walmart. I walked in and had the night manager call my parents as my cell phone was now dead. It was about 30 minutes from my house and my parents were on their way. Just as I thought I could relax and try to put these horrifying events behind me, Dave and his friends walked into the Walmart. They didn't see me, but I couldn't believe that they were in the same store. They were looking around like they were looking for something or someone. Was it me, or was I being paranoid? The next day, Amy called me and apologized all day, crying and asking what she could do to make it up to me. I got some solace that she confirmed the person I got into the car with was actually Dave and not some random guy, but was still left traumatized thinking about what could have happened. It's been years since that night, and I know it could have been a lot worse, and I'm lucky that I was able to leave with no physical harm, but still wouldn't wish the experience I had that night on my worst enemy. I haven't seen Dave, Skip, or any of the people I saw that night, and hope I never do again. Back when I was a student, I used to work as a bartender in a nightclub here in Liverpool. Most places kicked out at about 2 a.m., but we stayed until about 6 a.m. and just mopped up all the business that came spilling out of the other trendier places. This meant that we got some absolute messes propping up our bar on a nightly basis, and you could roughly divide the idiots that patronized us into 4 categories. 1. Happy drunks, occasionally annoying but generally favorable. 2. Sad drunks, frequently annoying, tend not to tip. 3. Sleepy drunks, usually have to rouse these buggers out from the warmer, comfier corners of the end of the night. And last but not least, the rare and mystical blackout drunks. Totally unpredictable, avoid at all costs, removed from premises as soon as possible. When I say blackout drunk, I don't necessarily mean people who just got too drunk to stand up and end up passing out. No. Blacking out when drinking is an actual medical thing. Don't quote me on the ins and outs, but from what I understand, some people have a very particular reaction to alcohol. Not all the time, just some of the time, and it causes a complete mental break. People can do outrageous things and have no memory of it whatsoever. They have zero inhibitions, zero social cues. The car is driving, there's just no one at the wheel. Now you see how dangerous that can be and why I added the whole removed from premises type thing. So the stage is set for my scariest post-work encounter ever. It's been a quiet night. People are coming and going in dribs and drabs, and we get this one guy who comes in dressed in what look like work gear. He seems a bit worse for the wear, but more like he just had a rough day, so my colleague gives him the benefit of the doubt and gives him one last pint of lager for the road. Maybe an hour after, he's staring into space with this glassy, watery look in his eyes. Classic blackout case. Not falling down drunk, still semi-lucid, but there's just no one behind the eyes. We're close to closing anyway, so I prompt the door staff to come over and ask him to leave. He seems a bit confused at first, but soon complies and he's out the door. No drama. We close, do a really quick clean down, and we're all out the doors about 45 minutes later. I usually walk all the way home since it's only a fairly short distance and the area tends to be completely deserted at the time of morning. Only on this occasion, our blackout drunk friend is sitting on a wall on the opposite side of the street, just staring into space like they always end up doing. But as I'm looking at him with a bit of concern, wondering how he's going to get himself home, he looks up at, notices me, and then immediately starts crossing the road towards me. He doesn't engage though. He just stays behind me on the pavement, following at a steady pace. I'm getting increasingly frightened, and I'm trying to keep my cool, but I can actually hear his footsteps getting louder and louder on the pavement behind me. So I pull out my phone and fake a call with my boyfriend. I was single at the time, saying I was about to catch the bus home. But what's that? You want to come and give me a lift? You'll be here any second because you're already in the area? Okay, thanks babe, you're the best. Then, heart pounding, I walk about 50 meters to the nearest bus stop and plonk my butt down on the bench. Blackout guy hangs around for a bit, not looking like he's doing anything in particular, but I know what he's hanging around for, and it's scaring the bejeebies out of me. But thankfully, with a bluff of my boyfriend coming to pick me up having apparently worked, he starts shuffling off along the road and eventually out of sight. Only trouble was, he walked the same way I needed to get home, but it was no massive issue. I could just hop the first bus, it was due in like 15 minutes, and take the L for the bus fare, but I'd definitely get home safe and sound. Bus comes, I get on, take a seat, happy days. Next bus stop comes along, bus stops, only one passenger shuffles onto the bus and drops a handful of change into the little coin tray. I look up. Guess who it is? It's Blackout Guy, who without looking at me walks past and takes a seat just behind me. I'm just absolutely bricking it by this point, and I've completely run out of ideas. I know the guy's going to get off at the same stop as me, follow me home, and then what? I lived alone at the time. I'd have been buggered. Out of pure nervousness, I remember checking my time. That's when I got the idea that saved me. Right by my flat, immediately as you get off the bus, there's a Tesco Metro. And since it was just past 7 a.m., it would have just opened. That Tesco would have been rocking a security guard and possibly an office I could ask him to hide me in. It wasn't the best idea, but it was definitely worth a shot, and it turned out it was the best idea I could possibly have had. Like clockwork, the guy got off the bus with me and followed me to the Tesco. I was a bit shaky when I approached the security guy, but as soon as I explained what the deal was, he ushered me off into a security office where they normally detain shoplifters and all that. Police were called, and the blackout guy actually hanged around the Tesco, waiting for me to reappear, so he was an easy caller. I'm not sure if they charged him with anything, or just gave him a bed for the night. I don't care though, to be honest. He was out of my hair, I was safe, and that's all I was arsed about. I don't know if he saw through my fake phone call or something, but him working out that I was on that bus was honestly one of the worst moments of my life. Like this proper oh no moment that I've never have repeated before or since. I just feel bad for girls who don't have anyone to run to when something like that happens. Girls who aren't as lucky as me, who don't get to go home, sometimes, ever again. I just finished my first year of university and had taken up a position as a taxi dispatcher with my boyfriend's cousin's taxi company. For the first week and a half, I worked mainly day shifts until the owner decided to extend the hours to 24/7, and I was the lucky employee who would be covering 3 of the 4 of these shifts a week. The next week, I was working my first night shift alone. The driver would be out all night looking for fares, which meant a lot of the night would be just me. I wasn't uneasy working such a shift by myself since I had worked at a 24-hour coffee shop and was used to midnight shifts. It was also a Wednesday or Thursday night, so it wasn't very busy. The best part about this job was that my boss let me use the internet to play video games on my laptop in the office. From the computer desk in the office, I could see the front door, a portion of the front desk, and most of the front windows, so I could keep a close eye on what was happening outside. Plus, the bell above the door always alerted me to a new customer, so I couldn't be caught off guard if I got too into my game. On this particular night, I was working with a taxi driver named Dave. Dave is about 6'3" and 300 pounds, plus he suffers from severe health problems, one of which made all of his movements slow and painful. He definitely wasn't Mr. Fitness or the type of person who would be able to defend himself or others very easily. Sometime during the early hours of the morning, around 1:30 to 2 a.m., Dave gets a call to go pick up someone in a town about 15 minutes away. He gathered up his stuff and drove into the night, while I headed into the office and continued playing my video game. About 15 minutes later, I caught something over the top of my laptop. My mind froze. I could hear panting, and in the reflection of the window I could see someone sitting in one of the waiting chairs. I walked to the doorway that connects the front room with the office. I glanced into the sitting area and nearly shit bricks. Some guy with a massive rat tail had managed to ninja his way into the office and was now sitting in one of the chairs with his face buried in his hands, panting heavily. He was dirty, sweaty, and sounded like he had just run a marathon. Now, the rat tail should have tipped me off, but I found it more hilarious than frightening. A few moments passed and I finally built up the courage to ask him if he needed a cab. He didn't respond at first. I asked him again, and he looks up at me. I took a step back into the office. His face was scratched and covered in blood from the wound on the top of his head. I was shocked and immediately offered assistance to him. He replies with, "I'm fine. I don't need no help. Just want to go home." I asked him if he needed a cab and, if so, where he was going. He told me he lives about 20 minutes away and wants Dave to take him home. After that, shit started to get weird. I called over to Dave using the radio to tell him that there was a fare in the office and that he wanted a ride. He told me he'd be another 10 minutes or so. My hand was on the phone the entire time in case this guy made any sudden movements. Instead of going back into the office, I decided it was best to stay out front where there are two great big bay windows that make it easy to see what is happening inside the taxi office. I didn't feel as though he was a threat at all, but he seemed really angry at something, so I wanted to make sure that if something happened to me, people would be able to see it. So I walked out into the front room, and as I get closer to the gentleman, that's when I see it. He's not just bleeding from the head, but from the shoulder and knee. I asked him again if he's okay, then I offered to call an ambulance for him. Bad idea.
"You don't need to be doing that,"
he told me.
"It ain't like I killed nobody, right? I never killed nobody. Don't go doing that. You don't need to call anyone. I just want to go home."
"I'm sorry. I just noticed that you're bleeding pretty badly and thought maybe you'd like someone to make sure you're okay," I replied.
"I didn't kill nobody. That asshole should have kept his mouth shut. He had what was coming to him. He shouldn't have said those things. But it ain't like I killed nobody. You don't need to call nobody. I just want to go home."
"Okay," I tell him. "But you're bleeding."
"It ain't like I killed nobody,"
he replied.
"I swear I didn't kill nobody. Please don't call the cops. I don't need the cops. I just need to go home. I didn't kill anyone."
Silence for a few minutes. He notices the phone clutched in my hand.
"I fell down,"
he blurted out.
"Pardon?" "I fell,"
he repeated.
"That's why I'm bleeding. I fell. It ain't like I killed nobody."
He suddenly got up and started pacing. He was growing impatient for his cab, and I was scared shitless. Blood was now on the chair and floor. I had the phone in my hand, and every once in a while he broke the silence with another string of incoherent babbling about how he had done nothing wrong because he hadn't killed anyone, and that I didn't need to call the cops because he was a good guy. Eventually Dave radios over that he's about 2 minutes away, and I breathe a sigh of relief. He pulled up out front. The man gets into the car and they drive off. Now I'm worried for Dave, so I call the cops. I reported what happened, and they followed the taxi cab to this guy's house where they arrested him. Turns out this guy had run away from a nearby bar after he had physically assaulted a fellow patron. To what extent, I never found out. He injured him with a sharp object, I assume a pocket knife or needle, took off running, fell and managed to find his way to the taxi office. During his time in the cab office, the police had been searching for him. So technically no, he didn't kill anyone, but he did assault and attempt to murder someone. I also found out that one of the other drivers, Steven, knew the guy from high school years ago. His name is Duke, which explains the rat tail, and he has a history of violence. He also has a history of coming home drunk and cracking his wife's skull open from time to time. Whether he had planned to that night, I couldn't say. But I'm just glad that the guy ended up in the drunk tank for the night. His wife was unharmed, and the guy who got stabbed apparently didn't die. At least, I assume he didn't, since I still see Duke every now and then walking the streets with his glorious rat tail, which means he didn't get arrested. But in all seriousness, I wish you guys could have seen this rat tail. That thing was impressive. It was winter 2012, and I was 18 or 19 at the time. I was working at a petrol station in an average-sized town in England. It was an okay job, good money for somebody who was at college at the time, and it was just a shame it was a weekend job. So while my friends were getting drunk and having fun, I was in a petrol station serving taxi drivers and the occasional drunk. It started off like any other night. Serve people, clean up, do stock, the average night shift work. Since it was winter, the night was really dark and you could only see faint outlines of people walking back and forth even with streetlights. The place where I worked was situated across the road from a pub and had an alley running beside it that led to a housing estate. Around 3 to 4 a.m. as I finished cleaning a set of shelves, I noticed a figure standing in the alley just out of the light, but just enough to hide his face, but you could make out his clothing. I initially brushed it off as somebody waiting for a taxi as it seemed harmless enough. I sat down in my chair behind the counter and looked at my phone and played some games for a bit. When I looked up, it was 5 a.m. and he was still there, waiting, watching me. To make my situation worse, after 5 there was hardly any traffic or passerbys. I had that guttural feeling that he had some harmful intent. I was safe, however, as I locked in till the morning. I stared back in a trance, trying to keep an eye on whatever he would do next. After a while, I needed to use the toilet, so I went and came back thinking that he might have walked off. But he didn't. He was still there. I then decided not to do my last job until my coworker came in to start their shift, as my last job was to take out the fire extinguishers and sand buckets. It got to be about 6 a.m. The figure faded back into the alley, and I didn't see him for the rest of the shift. When my coworker arrived, it was still dark, and I usually walked the 10 minutes back home, but I got a taxi home after that shift. I felt that the guy could be anywhere, still watching me. I told my coworkers and family members about my experience, and they said they personally haven't experienced anything like it and wouldn't like to either. I was very nervous when doing my shifts from then on, feeling like as soon as I let my guard down, he would strike, but thankfully nothing else happened after that. I quit the following summer to go to university. My first real job was working at a gas station when I was just 17 years old. The station itself was this rundown old building just outside of Mount Vernon, Illinois, well off the beaten path. The owners barely cleaned the place and were too cheap to maintain anything other than the gas pumps. The ceiling leaked, the entire rear room was a mess, and the employee's bathroom barely worked. It was like it was screaming out to me, "Hey kid, don't work here, it sucks." But what can I say? I needed the money. What's worse, the other 2 members of staff were some of the creepiest people I'd ever met. I strongly suspected one of them was a meth head, but I never get proof on that. But I literally know the other dude had been to prison for manslaughter. I mean, I never asked him about it. I'm not that stupid. But between you and me, if his personality was anything to go by, he must have had a pretty good lawyer to have gotten off with just a manslaughter conviction. But surprisingly, the scariest thing I ever experienced while working there wasn't anything to do with either of them. It actually involved my worst and most irrational fear. So my least favorite part of the job was taking out the trash at the end of a graveyard shift. Every single time I did it, I used to get the creeps thinking something was going to burst out of the dumpster and grab me. then drag me down to the garbage room or something. That, or how someone might be waiting for me, crouched among the trash bags, and I'd never see them until it was too late. Like I said, just one of those dumb, irrational fears you get when doing something all alone and late at night. But then this one night, I walk out the rear exit, full trash bag in hand, when I hear, "Hey, you." I freeze, turning to see nothing in the parking lot but a few sleeper trucks. It didn't help that it was almost pitch black out there, and I realized I can't see who's apparently talking to me. I start to get really nervous. I'm too anxious to say anything, and I simply start heading back inside when I hear it again. Hey, you." Someone was definitely calling out to me while also trying to remain as quiet as possible. It was the trying to stay quiet part that really gave me the willies. No one whose intentions are innocent talks like that. Not usually, anyway. My gut is just telling me, this is bad. This is really bad. And I'm smart enough to listen to it. The last thing I heard before I got back to safety was like, Hey, wait a minute, come here." Then I just shut the door, bolted, then started to close up for the evening. Instead of driving back, I called my dad and told him some sketchy guy was hanging around the parking lot and that I was scared. So, being the great father he was, he drove down to make sure I was safe and to give me a ride home, leaving my car in the parking lot until the next day. The following morning, I get a call from the manager telling me I don't have to go into work that afternoon. When I ask why, she tells me that about 15 minutes after my dad showed up to give me a ride home, a bunch of guys smashed their way into the gas station and basically ransacked the place. When I told him about the guy whispering to me in the parking lot, he just about freaked out, thanking God that I was okay and that they'd timed their raid around closing. Obviously, I was relieved too, like they totally smashed the place up, so if I'd been there, there's no telling what they would have done to me. But that wasn't what had my manager freaking out so much. It was the fact that the cops had told him how lucky I was, because this same gang had committed a bunch of other robberies in the area, and this was the only one in which they hadn't taken a hostage of some kind. One store owner was beaten half to death after he refused to tell them where his safe was. Turned out he didn't have one. He just took all his cash home with him every night. Trouble was, they didn't buy that story, and he ended up in the hospital for like a month. That could have been me. Really, it could have. And given that I was a 17-year-old girl at the time it happened, Jesus, I can't even imagine how rough I'd have had it. After that, my dad refused to let me work the graveyard shift, and I can't say I was too sore about that at all. This happened back when I was 14, but even with my bad memory, I remember this years later. I honestly think that this memory will haunt me for the rest of my life. I would often go walking either alone or with my neighbor, Jem, but this specific night she didn't go out with me. I usually went walking at around 9 at night, but was impatient that night, so I left about 15 minutes early. It was summer in Texas, but I grabbed my black hoodie anyways. The reason for this was because I was a pretty small kid, even for my age, and I would walk with a knife in my sleeve in case of a problem. There was security in this area, but they were pretty much useless and weren't fond of the kids anyways, so wearing black was to avoid them seeing me and to maybe help avoid being noticed by anyone else too. The area was heavily wooded and the roads had no streetlights. I had lived there my whole life though, so with the moonlight this wasn't really an issue. I could see things as much as I needed to. I walked to the park in the area and sat down on the swing set like I had a million times before. The park was old and wasn't very well taken care of, so the swing set creaked. The wooden picnic tables were half rotted with the paint mostly peeled away, and the metal slide was covered in rust. There was the main road that ran in front of the park and a branch-off road that ran along the side of the park with a thin line of trees between the side road and park. After a while, a favorite song of mine came on and I, of course, started singing to it, since singing was a big way I let out stress despite my stage fright. I had a tendency to not hold back when singing at this park since there was rarely people near it during the day, let alone at night. My blood ran cold though when I saw the shape of a person maybe 50 to 100 feet in front of me on the main road. The main reason for the chill was the fear that this random person heard me sing. But then I got a deeper bad feeling. Something was just wrong about them. I noticed that the person was walking fast, really fast, almost at running speed. I figured he might have been running from something or after something, but when I looked around everywhere that I could possibly see from where I was, I saw nothing else but them. They soon passed by the park, not seeming to notice me, and after a few minutes of waiting to make sure that they were gone, I continued singing. After a couple of more songs, I decided that it was time to go home. I still had that bad feeling, that uneasy pit in my stomach that you get when you're being watched. I even thought that I saw something behind the tree line beside the side road and the swings, but I brushed that off as an animal or something. Deer were really common, so were dogs and things, so it was probably me getting spooked by an animal again. But the feeling was eating away at me, so I cut my usual 30-minute to an hour walk to about 10 minutes. So I got up and started to leave the park, turning onto the main road to go home. As I was leaving, I saw a person walking towards the main road from the road that I ran right along the park. It looked like the same person as before. It was clearly a man. He must have been visiting a friend or something, right? Even if that was the case, I crossed the opposite side of the street so I wouldn't pass directly by him. He didn't look particularly dangerous or unusual, so sadly no weird, creepy, homeless-looking man for this story. I just got a bad feeling from him, which is probably what makes him even more terrifying. He got to the intersection before me and stopped. I passed by and glanced at the man, taking in what details I could under the moonlight that came from between the tree branches. He looked normal. He was probably an average height, wearing a pure white ball cap with no logos that cast a shadow over his face, and a pure white polo-type shirt. There wasn't a speck of dirt on the man. He looked well kept, and it made the moonlight almost shine on him like he was some kind of ghost, which just added to my uneasy feeling. He clearly wasn't out there to be exercising or anything like that. He watched me as I passed by, and I tried to pretend that I didn't notice. I would occasionally look around as if though I was just looking at the woods so I could see the man out of my peripheral vision. I didn't want or need to see the man in detail, partly because I was scared of the possibility of seeing something else too. Just because the man was much larger than me didn't mean that he wasn't probably armed as well. Once I was around 15 feet past the intersection, I did one of these glances, and my stomach dropped as I saw him turn and start to follow me. Maybe he was just going for an extra long walk or something, right? He probably isn't following me, right? Then another thought popped in my mind, and it sent my stomach to my feet. I'd been there for probably 10 minutes or so singing after he passed. What if he wasn't visiting anyone? What if he was the thing I saw just beyond the tree line? That's kind of obvious now that was almost definitely the case, but let's be fair. When do 14-year-olds ever think through all the details of a situation completely during the situation? He was probably watching me the whole time. He could have snuck up and done God knows what at any time. I kept doing my glances and noticed that he was getting closer and closer. I gripped my knife tighter, ready in case I had to use it. The chance of it going well wasn't the best, but it was a better chance than not trying at all. But I wanted that to be a last-ditch option. I tried to make sure it wasn't obvious that I was keeping tabs on him. I didn't want him getting anxious and having him decide to speed up whatever plan it was. I was only halfway home, and this was before I had surgery on my ankle, so I was absolutely sure that he could catch me before I'd reach the house if I started running where I was, so that wasn't an option whatsoever. I didn't have many current options though, so the one I chose was to bide my time till an opportunity opened up. I kept walking at a rather quick but unpanicked pace, keeping tabs on the man as he inched closer and kept an eye out for opportunities. And an opportunity came, and it felt like it was sent from God himself. I saw headlights. A car was rolling towards me at a careful pace, like normal considering the animals I mentioned earlier. It was Jem's dad. I recognized the shape of the lights, and as the car got closer, I became convinced it was him. I was never so relieved to see that tiny white car. I tried signaling him without letting the man know that I was, but he just passed by. He must have thought I was just saying hi. I glanced back again. Even though he didn't stop, he did exactly what I needed. He did slow down a bit as he passed. The man backed up a lot and crossed to the other side of the road. The headlights were on him and he couldn't see me at least for around 5 or 6 seconds, maybe a bit longer including readjusting to the dark. I walked faster. I didn't run, that way my steps wouldn't be too loud, but I rounded the corner before he'd be able to readjust and get sight of me again. Once I could turn and no longer see him, I rushed home and locked the door. I knew better than to leave it unlocked since after all, I lived in the woods. Just because I couldn't see him anymore didn't mean that he wasn't nearby, and didn't mean he couldn't see me. As stupid as this next part is, it's probably for the best that I did it. I texted Jem. I asked her to meet me outside right now because something happened and I needed to come over. She said okay, and we both went outside, and as soon as I saw her in the driveway, I sprinted to her house. I didn't want to be outside any longer than I had to be. She kept panicking and asked what happened and what was wrong, and once I caught my breath, I told her everything. Right after I got done explaining, her dad walked in the house. He looked at Jem, seeming worried, then noticed me hiding behind her. He looked relieved and told her, "I was about to tell you to ask her to come over here." I asked him if he saw the man following me, and he said in the affirmative. He didn't really see his face, but that it was looking like he was trying to make it look like he was on a phone when he wasn't holding anything. But that wasn't even close to the worst part. I think this was the first time I've seen this man scared, and I'm not sure if I've ever seen fear like this from him since. He told us the man wasn't alone. There was a gate at the front of where I live that needed a car to get in. Apparently there was another man outside the gate who looked similar to the first, standing by a van. That meant they didn't live there, didn't want security knowing they were there, and wanted to get out quickly and quietly after they did whatever they were there for. Needless to say, I spent that night at Jem's that night, and I have no clue what would have happened had Jem's dad not driven by, or if I would have left at my normal time. I was 17 in the 11th grade. I usually didn't accept random requests on my Instagram, especially if we had no mutuals. I took my page off private for a while, and so anyone could follow me. This is when I got a notification that he started following me. The page had a normal following, not small enough to question whether it was a fake account or not. He had multiple pictures of himself with friends and family with captions and all. His comments were off for all of his posts, which wasn't a red flag since I had mine off too. Immediately after following me, he went through my profile and liked all of my pictures. He was a fit, good-looking guy, so I was flattered. Not long after, he DM'd me replying to a story of mine asking me if I was from such and such a city and that he was from there too. We immediately hit it off and DM'd nonstop for a while. It didn't feel forced, and we never ran out of things to talk about. We eventually swapped phone numbers and started texting. He told me he was studying at a really good university, which was in a city 2 hours away from where we both lived. Our talks escalated to day-to-day phone calls, which lasted for hours. I sincerely started growing feelings for him, and he made it clear he felt the same for me. We would talk about our deepest insecurities, our past, what we wanted our futures to look like, etc. It had been about 2 months of talking, and I was undeniably eager to meet up in person. He would tell me he was coming to visit home on the weekend, but would always come up with an excuse as to why he couldn't make it. He gave very convincing and detailed excuses, never vague, so I didn't question it. I hadn't told any friends about him until my best friend and I had a sleepover. I ended up telling her about him, showed her his pictures, and didn't leave out that we hadn't met yet. Wanting to look out for me, she suggested I ask him to video chat to make sure he is who he says he is before meeting up. She told me she didn't want to freak me out, but that she was sure that she had seen his pictures on Tumblr before. There's a tool on Google that can be used to locate social media accounts and articles where the pictures have been posted. While she was at that, I called him and asked him if he was home and alone before asking him to video chat so he couldn't make up an excuse on the spot. He said he was home and alone, but couldn't video chat because of his weak internet connection. My heart sank into my stomach. The possibility of being catfished was not far-fetched anymore. I quickly downloaded WhatsApp because I remember him telling me he spoke to his parents on it. Before doing that, my friend showed me the results of what she found, which devastated me to my core. The man in the pictures was a French model and singer. We found the exact pictures of that POS used on his catfish profile on an actual verified Instagram account. My devastation turned into anger, then turned into absolute disgust and revulsion when I saw his profile picture on WhatsApp. He was evidently much older than he claimed he was, probably in his 30s, a complete different race than what he portrayed to be, lied about being a university student, etc. P.S. I have no preference to what comes to race or nationality, but he literally lied to me in detail about being part Italian and part Colombian. He even made up an excuse as to why he didn't speak Italian or Spanish when he claimed he frequently visited back home. I wanted to crawl into a hole and die. I started to sob uncontrollably and confronted him on WhatsApp. He went on to explain how he came across my profile and wanted desperately to get to know me. He said I knew I wouldn't be interested in who he actually is and wouldn't be attracted to him, so instead he used his fake account, which he was already using and active on prior to come across my profile. He said he came close to coming clean multiple times, but was afraid of how I would react. He said even though his persona was fake, everything else was genuine. It turned out that he was a 31-year-old mechanic and living with his parents. He even confessed to driving to my neighborhood, finding my high school and following me around as I went about my day. I blocked him off WhatsApp, then he quickly started texting my number, begging me not to block that too and to give him a chance to explain things face to face. I went on to block him on everything, feeling absolutely heartbroken and betrayed while doing so. I spent months of my life daydreaming and fantasizing about how it would be like when we finally met in person and where it would go from there. Grew genuine feelings for him and even considered applying for the same university he was supposedly studying at. I got over it eventually, but I've definitely grown to be very paranoid and distrusting when it comes to meeting people online. I'm happily married now, but I wonder what would have happened if he and I met in person, and the consequences I would have faced for being so naive and oblivious. Back when I was still a senior in high school, me and my mom went on a trip to the movies. It was this regular mother-daughter bonding ritual we used to have. Catch a movie, critique it, and then hit up the Bob Evans next door for dinner. We'd always pick up my dad something in a takeout box too, and I really miss those days. But anyway, we have our food and drive home, just like we always did, and the rest of the night was uneventful. But the next morning, I wake up to a Facebook friend request from a name I didn't recognize. Thinking it might have been a mutual, I just accepted, but then like 5 minutes later, I get a message from the same account that says something like, "Hey, I know this might sound a little weird, but I saw you at the Bob Evans last night and I wondered if you might like to go out sometime." So I'm like, how did someone figure out my name? Did they overhear my mom say it or something? Like, I get he was polite, but it still creeped me out. Why would you go to those lengths to find me? And he must have been looking for hours. Immediately, there's all these red flags, so I had no intention of accepting his invitation, but at the same time, I didn't want to be a jerk to him. So I messaged him back like, "Hi, yeah, I was there, but I'm actually kind of seeing someone right now, and I don't think they'd be too happy if we went out." At first, their reply was encouraging, and they seemed to take it on the chin. They say like, "That sucks. Sorry if this is awkward now." I respond, "No, don't worry. You didn't know. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend though." It was a close-ended reply, you know, the kind that's designed to just end the conversation. Next thing, he starts typing and I figured he's going to just carry on being gentlemanly, creepily direct, but gentlemanly, I suppose. But no. There's this very subtle shift in his tone when he says, "I just figured, since I went to all this effort to find you, you might give me a chance." This is where I saw a kind of, opportunity. I had literally zero clue how this guy had found me, and I didn't like the idea that just anyone could look me up online no matter how innocent their intentions were. So I straight up asked him, "How did you find me?" He starts typing and stopping, typing and stopping, and I can tell he's thinking of the right way to phrase it. Then he says something like, "Where there's a will, there's a way. I can find anyone online. It's easy. When I set my mind to something, I achieve it. Is your current boyfriend an overachiever like that?" I distinctly remember him using that term, overachiever, and was honestly so cringe. If I wasn't put off before, I certainly was then. But still, I wanted to find out how this creep had managed to track me down. So I might have done something stupid to get him to talk and said, "Honestly, no, and it's kinda hot that you're so smart and stuff. So, how did you do it?" He responds, "I was the one who swiped your mom's card," he replied. So, a liar too. He wasn't some hacker. He just worked at the Bob Evans. So yeah, he probably had overheard my name, then just matched it up with the name on my mom's card. Then bingo, he finds me on Facebook. I had to hold back from just letting loose on this guy, but if he was that much of a psycho, then I figured it was better to not make him mad. "Ah, sneaky. I like it," I replied. "But like I said, kinda seeing someone right now, so thanks, but no thanks. Bye." I mute the conversation, but don't block the guy or unfriend him or anything. See, making him mad I was worried about. Then I just go about the rest of my day. Yeah, I told all my friends how creepy I was, and I casually suggested to my mom we pick a new food venue for our post-movie dinners. But other than that, I just went about my day as usual. It's kind of weird how this pattern repeated itself. The first time I'm asleep, blissfully ignorant that some creep is plugging my name into Facebook, probably to perv at my display picture. The second time I had him on mute, so I had no idea what was going on in that little message thread. It wasn't until later on that night that I opened my messenger on my phone and actually saw the little 44 notification count next to his name that I realized he'd sent me other messages. And yes, it did say 44. He'd sent 44 different messages, mostly rants, and he'd been sending them on and off all day. But it wasn't until I actually read what they said that I started to freak out. I'm not going to type up everything I remember him saying, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be able to guess the majority of it. Think nice guy style put-downs coupled with threats of actual violence. He basically said that if he'd managed to track me down online in a few hours, imagine what he could learn by the end of the week. He said he had friends that would help him break into our house. After that, they'd tie my parents up, kill them in front of me, then take turns abusing me until I was used up and lifeless. And that's the clean version of it, condensed into 2 sentences. 44 different lengthy messages he sent me. Think about that. The final message I read, it went on, before I ran downstairs to tell my mom and dad, was the message that read, "I'm in my car, and I'm looking for your house." I didn't know he was just trying to scare me, so I was crying as Dad called the cops. The guy ended up getting arrested for the threats he made, and I know he got fired from the Bob Evans because my mom kicked up a stink about it after the arrest. I never saw the guy again, so I'm thinking it was a case of his bark being louder than his bite. But I know that there are other women out there who aren't so lucky, and their stalkers are much more willing to get up close and personal. I just hope we can one day live in a world where men don't act all predatory and creepy with women they like. Like, it's so counterintuitive to what we want in a man. I wish they just understand that. But till then, I suppose all we can do is be safer online and with dating apps, and hope we never run into that one sick psychopath that won't take no for an answer.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.